Now let's look at how we can fine-tune our selection, make it even more accurate in a couple of ways. First of all, making sure our base selection is as accurate as we can, and then using a wonderful command called Refine Edge. Now one of the things that you'll find with the quick selection tools we talked about earlier is that you can always be adding and subtracting. The adding happens automatically. You don't have to hold down any keys. To remove from a selection, you hold down Option or Alt, and you see you get a little minus sign. Now don't be surprised if there are times where you have to kind of go back and forth a little bit to add and take away, and it kind of almost learns along the way. Now one thing you do have to keep in mind is sometimes there's not enough of an edge no matter what you do for the quick selection to find it. So one of the ways we can fine-tune a selection is also to do this, and that is switch tools. I'm just going to go to my lasso tool, and now I'll hold down the Shift key to add to the selection and just tell Photoshop I want to add this piece right here. And you'll see it just adds it in. Now if I had a little bit too much, I could hold down the Option or Alt key and remove this part, just circle it around. So one of our recurring themes here is, remember, we want to end up with a really good selection. So don't worry about trying to get it in one shot. I might start with a quick selection tool and then switch to a different selection tool. Doesn't really matter. Just remember, other than the quick selection tool, every other tool you have to hold down a key, the Shift key to add to the selection, Option or Alt to remove from the selection. So at this point, I've got what looks like a pretty good selection, although I know I'm missing a bit of hair, but I'm not worried about that at this point. My base selection, as I would call it, is to get me started. Then I click on Refine Edge. Now mine is already doing this, but just so you know, these are the different options you can look at. The one that I find the most useful is on layers, and that's because, remember, we've already dragged her onto her new background. And the reason I do that is because, as I've said a number of times, and I'm going to keep saying it, it's so much easier to make decisions based on the context that you're in. In other words, I'm seeing her on the background. I used to do things like look at it on a white background, but then I'd start to go, oh, this doesn't look good, that doesn't look good. And it might not look good on a white background, but unless your intention is to keep her on a white background, why not look at it in context? Now, there's nothing wrong with occasionally going to black and white view to take a look at what the mask you're going to get. I would do that too, but I'm going to spend most of my time with this on layers. Now we need to talk about how we adjust the edge. Remember, the quick selection tool found the edge, now we're trying to refine it. So here's the first thing I would say is, if you look at your image and suddenly realize, oops, I missed a whole part of her elbow, this is not the place to fix it. In a case like that, you'd want to cancel, go back and redo your selection, and then come back to Refine Edge. This is really for, I already have a really good start on my selection, I'm just trying to make the edge a little better. There is a function called Smart Radius here, which means it will attempt to distinguish between things that should have hard edges, like her arms and legs and so on, and things that have softer edges, like her hair. The challenge is, where do you put this? If I move this slider up really high, while it's starting to get more hair, it's actually not doing very good things to her arms. In fact, let's show you the mask. You can see that's just not good at all. So I don't want to go that far. In fact, I would normally do this just a little bit, and what I really use is this tool. It's called the Refine Radius tool. It's actually already chosen by default. I'm going to zoom in just a little bit closer here. And all I'm going to do, I have a really small brush size, and I'm just kind of brushing over where I think there might be a few more hairs in here that I want to get. And you'll see it basically finds them. If you kind of go halfway on her existing hair or the parts you want to get, you can do the same thing here. See, I think there's a few more hairs sticking out here. Now sometimes what will happen is you'll do that and you still won't see anything. However, if you go to this black and white view, often you'll see, well, I actually did find some little hairs. Look at that. We go up a little bit. You see this? It's found some of those fine little hairs that were there. And remember, we're looking at this with the background in mind. That actually looks pretty good to me, although I can see there's just a tiny little bit around her legs here. I still have to fix this part. We'll fix that later on. So I could try painting around, but that would be kind of laborious to do that. So what I usually do is just shift the edge a little bit, just kind of a negative amount. Now keep in mind this also, I'm zoomed in greater than 100%. So some of the decisions I'm making may not be the best. The other thing is, this is not my final adjustment in terms of contrast and brightness and things like that and exposure, because I'm going to go back to camera raw. This was just to get a good selection. So I would normally attack it this way and go, well, that looks pretty good to me. I'm going to output this to a layer mask, which means preserve the camera raw smart object, but output the end result to a layer mask. So when I click OK, now I have my so-called finished product, but it's not really finished yet because a couple things. First of all, this is camera raw. I want to double click on that camera raw smart object to say I really increased the exposure, but when I photographed this, I deliberately was trying to make it have a little darker feel to it. I might lighten up the blacks just a little bit, but that's kind of the look I was going for, as a more dramatic kind of a look. So I click OK. That'll go back to Photoshop and update. Now, because this has created a mask, it also means that I can continue to work on it. For example, down here in my original selection, I realize I missed a little bit, so I would just take my lasso tool and just do a little selection in here, and then on the mask, fill that with black. Now, black is my background color, so I press Command Delete or Control Backspace as a quick way to fill with black. Now, in this case, I wouldn't actually remove the shadow because I kind of want that there, and as we'll see later on, we're going to build on this to add more of a shadow to try and make it look more realistic. But overall, that's the approach I would take. So Refine Edge is going to be a really useful tool for you, but it starts with having a good selection to begin with. I'm going to save this so we can come back to it later. Just save it as a copy. I'm going to save it as a Photoshop document so that it'll be just like this when I come back to it later on. Now, just to go back a second, I'm going to load this as selection and then delete the layer mask so we can talk about Refine Edge for one more second. One of the challenges that we face here is that there is no magic number, and I just want to stress that because I've talked to a lot of people say, I can't get this to work. I try at a low number, a high number. Technically, there are probably some range of numbers that work better than others, but I found it really varies so much with the image. And the approach that I often take is I'm quite happy with the result I got here doing it in one shot. But if you have challenging hair, and that's the biggest challenge, of course, with making a selection of things like fur and hair and things like that. If you have something with what I would call very challenging hair, then what you want to do is approach it in pieces instead of trying to do it all at once, and we'll look at that next.